35 years ago, right here in Overton County, a farmhand named Samuel Brown, folks called him Powder, made a choice that changed 3 young lives. One October night in 1940, he stood between danger and the Reynolds sisters.
The Tennessee execution of 1940. Powder Brown died shielding 3 sisters from 2 masked gunmen. The most extraordinary act of sacrifice in Tennessee history and the most heartbreaking story of courage the Appalachian Mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of Powder Brown. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Hancock County, Tennessee, so known throughout the region as one of the poorest and most isolated corners of the state. The Clinch Mountain Range rises here in ancient folds that have sheltered families for generations, peaks and hollows that seem designed to hide those who wish to remain hidden from the world beyond. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from the rules and regulations of the lowlands, and their descendants maintained that spirit of independence through 2 centuries of change. They were a people who valued loyalty above all other virtues, who would die for those they loved without hesitation, and the young man named Powder Brown would prove the truth of that claim in the most devastating way imaginable. You see, in these mountains, family was not merely a biological relationship, but the foundation of everything that made life possible. A family's members were bound to each other by ties that outsiders could never fully understand, obligations that transcended individual interest, loyalties that could not be broken by any force on earth. To betray family was the worst sin imaginable, worse than murder, worse than theft, worse than any crime the law might punish. And to protect family, to sacrifice oneself for those one loved, was the highest virtue, the act that defined a person's worth more completely than anything else they might do in their entire life. The young man who would become known throughout Tennessee simply as Powder was born Jeremiah Isaiah Brown in 1922 in a cabin on the banks of Mulberry Creek that his grandfather had built with his own hands. He was the 4th of 7 children, born into a family that had worked this land since before the Civil War, that had fought in every American conflict, that had buried 5 generations in the small cemetery on the ridge above the home place. The nickname that would define him came early, given by his father, who noticed how the boy's hair turned white in the summer sun, bleached by hours of outdoor work until it resembled nothing so much as gunpowder dust. That's right. Powder Brown had grown up in a world where hard work and family loyalty were the measures of a person's character. He had learned to plow and plant and harvest before he was 10 years old, had taken on responsibilities that would have overwhelmed children from easier circumstances, had absorbed the understanding that life in the mountains required effort and sacrifice from everyone who hoped to survive. He was not exceptional in any obvious way, not smarter or stronger or more ambitious than his siblings, but he possessed a quality that everyone who knew him recognized, a capacity for devotion that seemed to have no limits. His childhood had been shaped by the rhythms of farm life, the endless cycle of work that defined existence in the mountains. He had attended school when farm work permitted, had learned to read and write well enough to manage practical tasks, had absorbed what education the one-room schoolhouse could provide. He was intelligent enough, his teachers noted, capable of more than his circumstances would likely allow, but intelligence mattered less in the mountains than willingness to work and loyalty to family. By those measures, Powder Brown was wealthy beyond calculation. The summers of his youth had been filled with the hard labor that mountain children knew from an early age. He had worked alongside his father and brothers in the tobacco fields, had helped with the timber cutting that provided the family's primary cash income, had learned the skills of farming and forestry that every mountain boy was expected to master. The work was exhausting, stretching from dawn to dusk, leaving little time for the leisure that children in other places might have enjoyed. But Powder never complained, never shirked his responsibilities, never gave his parents reason to doubt his willingness to carry his share of the family's burden. The winters had been different, the enforced idleness of the cold months providing time for activities that summer did not allow. He had learned to hunt and trap, skills that supplemented the family's food supply and provided furs that could be sold for cash. He had developed a reputation as an excellent marksman, able to hit targets that others could barely see, patient enough to wait for the perfect shot. These skills would prove tragically irrelevant on the night of his death, when there was no opportunity to fight back, only to protect. His religious faith had been formed in the small Baptist church, where his family had worshipped for generations. He had been baptized in the creek below the church, had attended services every Sunday his entire life, had absorbed the teachings about sacrifice and love and the duty that Christians owe to one another. The preacher's sermons about laying down one's life for others were familiar to him, stories he had heard since childhood, without imagining that he would ever be called to live them out. But when the moment came, the teachings were there, part of who he was, shaping a response that seemed as natural as breathing. The family that shaped his character was large and close-knit, bound together by the shared struggle of mountain life. His father, Isaiah Brown, was a farmer and occasional timber worker, a man who had never traveled more than 50 miles from his birthplace, but who knew every hollow and ridge in Hancock County as intimately as he knew his own children's faces. His mother, Rebecca, was a woman of quiet strength who managed a household that was always on the edge of insufficiency, stretching resources that never quite reached far enough. Together, they had raised 7 children who loved each other with an intensity that outsiders often found remarkable. Powder was particularly close to his 3 younger sisters, Martha, born in 1924, Ruth, born in 1926, and little Sarah, born in 1929. The bond between them had formed in early childhood and had only strengthened as they grew. He was their protector from the time they could walk, the one who watched over them, who fought their battles, who would have done anything to keep them safe. They adored him in return, followed him everywhere he would allow, trusted him with the complete faith that young children give to those who have earned it. The relationship between Powder and his sisters was different from the bonds he shared with his brothers. With his brothers, there was competition, the natural rivalry of boys measuring themselves against each other. With his sisters, there was only tenderness, a protective instinct that had emerged in him almost from the moment each of them was born. He remembered holding Martha when she was just days old, remembered the feeling of her tiny hand wrapped around his finger, remembered the vow he had made to himself that nothing would ever hurt her while he lived to prevent it. He had made the same vow when Ruth was born, and again when Sarah arrived. Each sister had claimed a piece of his heart, had become a person he would die for without hesitation. He had not known, could not have known, that this commitment would be tested in the most terrible way imaginable. But the commitment itself was real, had been real for years before the night when it would be fulfilled. Martha was the serious one, responsible beyond her years, her mother's helper in all things domestic. She had inherited Rebecca's practical intelligence and her capacity for quiet endurance, and by the time she was 14 she could manage the household as competently as her mother. She worried about things, Martha did, fretted about details that her sisters ignored, carried a sense of responsibility that sometimes seemed too heavy for her young shoulders. Powder understood her better than anyone except their mother, recognized the burden she carried, did what he could to lighten it through his own contributions to the family's welfare. Ruth was the dreamer, always imagining worlds beyond the mountains, filling notebooks with stories and poems that she shared only with Powder, trusting him to appreciate what others might mock. She had a gift for words that no one in the family could explain, an ability to capture feelings and images that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her experience. Powder was her first reader, the audience she trusted most completely, and he took this responsibility seriously, offering encouragement when encouragement was needed, and gentle criticism when criticism might help her grow. He believed in her talent, believed she might someday escape the mountains through her writing, believed she deserved opportunities he could not provide. And Sarah was the family's joy, a laughing child whose presence lifted spirits and whose smile could dispel any gloom. She was the baby of the family, spoiled by her siblings in ways that their parents gently discouraged but secretly appreciated. Sarah had a gift for happiness that seemed almost miraculous given the hardships of their life, an ability to find delight in small things that others overlooked. She was Powder's favorite, though he would never have admitted it, the one whose laughter could brighten even his darkest moods. The thought of anything happening to her was unbearable, a possibility he could not contemplate without feeling something close to physical pain. By 1940, Powder Brown was 18 years old, a young man on the threshold of adulthood, who had not yet decided what form his adult life would take. He had finished what schooling was available, had worked alongside his father in the fields and timber operations, had begun to think about the future in ways that his childhood had not required. Some young men his age were already married, already starting families of their own, but Powder had not yet found the woman who would become his wife. His sisters teased him about his shyness around girls, about the way he blushed when certain names were mentioned, but he took their teasing with the good humor that characterized all his interactions with them. The events that would define his life and death began with a dispute that had nothing to do with him or his family, a conflict between two other clans that had been festering for years. The Hendricks and the Carters had been feuding over a piece of land that both families claimed, a conflict that had begun with legal filings and had escalated through a series of confrontations that had not yet turned deadly, but seemed destined to do so. The Brown family had stayed neutral in this dispute, had maintained relationships with members of both clans, had hoped that the conflict would resolve itself without drawing them in. Now, to understand what happened on the night of October 15, 1940, you need to understand the nature of the Hendricks-Carter dispute and the mistake that would prove fatal to Powder Brown. That's right. The conflict had reached a crisis point in the fall of 1940, with both sides preparing for violence that seemed inevitable. Young men from both families had armed themselves, had made threats that could not easily be withdrawn, had created a situation where someone was almost certainly going to die. The leader of the Carter faction was a man named Virgil Carter, a brutal figure who had already served time in prison for assault and who had returned to the mountains with a reputation for violence that made everyone wary of crossing him. Virgil was 35 years old, scarred by the prison years that had hardened whatever softness might once have existed in his character. He had decided that the Hendricks family needed to be taught a lesson, that a show of force would end the dispute on terms favorable to the Carters, and he had begun planning an attack that would make his intentions unmistakably clear. The target Virgil selected was the Hendricks homestead, where the family patriarch lived with his wife and several unmarried children. The plan was simple: arrive after dark, fire shots into the house to terrorize the occupants, and deliver a message that further resistance would result in worse consequences. It was the kind of night-riding intimidation that had a long history in the mountains, effective precisely because everyone understood that the threats could be carried out if the warnings were not heeded. The mistake that would cost Powder Brown his life was a matter of simple geography. The Brown family home sat on a ridge that overlooked the road to the Hendricks place, and from certain angles, in certain light, the two properties could be confused by someone unfamiliar with the area. Virgil Carter had recruited his cousin, a man named Floyd Carter, to help with the attack, and Floyd had volunteered to guide them to the target. But Floyd had been drinking, his judgment impaired, his memory of the route less reliable than he had claimed. When they set out that October night, they were headed not for the Hendricks place, but for the Brown home, where Powder and his family slept peacefully, unaware that death was approaching through the darkness. And that's when the tragedy began to unfold. You see, the Brown family had no enemies, had given no one reason to wish them harm, had lived their lives in the quiet way that mountain people valued. Isaiah Brown was respected throughout the county as an honest man who kept his word. Rebecca Brown was known for her kindness, for the food she provided to neighbors in need, for the help she offered to anyone who asked. Their children were well regarded, hard-working young people who caused no trouble and created no conflicts. There was no reason for anyone to attack them, no grievance that might justify what was about to happen. The night of October 15, 1940, was cold and clear, the kind of autumn night that settles over the mountains when the season is turning and winter is beginning to make its presence felt. The Brown family had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of hard work, looking forward to the rest that the darkness provided. Isaiah and Rebecca slept in the main bedroom of the cabin, while the boys shared one room and the girls another. The cabin was quiet, the fire banked for the night, the only sounds the normal creaks and settles of an old house breathing in the cold. The day had been ordinary in every way, no different from 100 other days that had preceded it. The family had worked in the fields, harvesting the last of the season's crops before the frost could claim them. They had shared supper together, the same simple meal of cornbread and beans and vegetables from the garden that they ate most nights. They had talked about the weather, about the work that remained to be done, about the small events that made up their daily lives. No one had sensed that anything unusual was approaching, that this would be the last normal evening they would ever spend together. Powder had been unable to sleep, troubled by thoughts he could not quite identify, a restlessness that kept him staring at the ceiling while his brothers snored in the beds beside him. He had been thinking about the future, about what he wanted to do with his life, about the girl in the next hollow who had caught his attention and whom he was too shy to approach. He had been thinking about his sisters, about how quickly they were growing up, about the changes that would come as they became young women and eventually left the family to build lives of their own. These were the ordinary thoughts of an 18-year-old boy, unremarkable except that they would be the last thoughts he would have before his life changed forever. He had finally gotten up, intending to sit by the fire for a while, hoping that the warmth and the quiet would settle whatever was keeping him awake. The main room was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace, shadows moving across the walls in patterns he had known since childhood. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake his parents or siblings, finding his way by memory rather than by sight. He had just reached the chair by the fireplace when he heard the sound of horses approaching, heard voices that did not belong to anyone he recognized, heard the unmistakable click of guns being cocked. The sound froze him in place for a moment, his mind struggling to understand what was happening. Visitors did not come to the Brown home in the middle of the night. Friends and neighbors would have called out, would have announced themselves, would not have approached with weapons drawn. The only explanation that made sense was that these were enemies, strangers who intended harm, and the realization sent adrenaline flooding through his body. The first shots came through the windows, shattering glass and sending splinters of wood flying through the room where Powder stood. He dropped to the floor instinctively, his mind racing to understand what was happening, to identify the threat, to figure out what needed to be done. His first thought was for his family, for his parents in their bedroom, for his brothers in their room, for his sisters in theirs. The shooting continued, a barrage of gunfire that seemed designed to destroy everything in its path. Powder heard his sisters screaming, heard the terror in their voices as bullets tore through the walls of their room. He did not hesitate, did not think about his own safety, did not consider any option except getting to them, protecting them, putting his body between them and the guns that were trying to kill them. He ran through the hallway as bullets flew around him, burst through the door of their room, and found Martha and Ruth and Sarah huddled in the corner, crying and screaming as the world exploded around them. What happened next would be reconstructed from the testimony of his sisters, the only survivors who witnessed his final moments. Powder threw himself over them, covered their bodies with his own, created a human shield that absorbed the bullets that would otherwise have killed them. He did not speak, did not cry out, did not do anything except hold his sisters as tightly as he could, while the gunfire continued to pour into the room. The bullets struck him again and again in the back, in the shoulders, in the legs, each impact a wound that would have been fatal on its own. He felt the pain, his sisters would later say, felt each bullet tear through his body, but he did not move, did not release them, did not do anything that might expose them to the death that was hunting them. He held them until the shooting stopped, held them until the sound of horses retreating told them that the attackers were leaving, held them until he could hold them no longer, and his arms finally fell away. Martha was the first to understand what had happened, the first to realize that her brother was no longer holding her, but lying still on the floor, his body torn by wounds that no one could survive. She screamed his name, tried to turn him over, saw in the moonlight that filtered through the shattered windows that his eyes were open but seeing nothing. He was dead, had been dead for several seconds, had continued to shield them even after life had left his body. The instinct to protect them had been stronger than death itself. The scene that the surviving family members discovered when they emerged from their own rooms was one of devastation and horror. Isaiah Brown had been wounded by shots that came through his bedroom wall, a bullet lodged in his shoulder that would leave him permanently disabled. Rebecca had been untouched physically, but would never fully recover from the psychological trauma of what she witnessed. The three boys, Powder's older brothers, had escaped injury by pure chance, the shots that penetrated their room missing them by inches. But Powder was gone, and his sisters were alive only because he had chosen to die in their place. the aftermath of the attack, brought the truth of what had happened into terrible clarity. Virgil Carter and Floyd Carter were identified within days, their boasting about the attack overheard by witnesses who reported what they had learned to the sheriff. When confronted with the evidence, Floyd broke down and confessed, explaining the target had been the Hendricks family, that they had gotten lost, that they had attacked the wrong house. The revelation that Powder Brown had died because of a mistake, because two men were too drunk and too stupid to find the right target, added a layer of absurdity to the tragedy that made it even harder to bear. The arrest of the Carter cousins brought some measure of accountability but could not restore what had been lost. Virgil Carter was charged with murder, Floyd with conspiracy and accessory charges. Their trial became a sensation throughout Tennessee, drawing attention to the feuding culture that still persisted in some mountain communities, raising questions about law enforcement and the failure to prevent such violence. The prosecution sought the death penalty for Virgil, arguing that the cold-blooded nature of the attack, even if misdirected, warranted the ultimate punishment. The trial was held in the county seat, in a courtroom packed with spectators who had come from throughout the region to witness the proceedings. The Brown family sat in the front row, Isaiah with his arm in a sling, Rebecca pale and aged beyond her years, the three surviving boys stoic and silent, the three sisters unable to look at the men who had killed their brother. The tension in the room was palpable, an almost physical presence that affected everyone who entered. The prosecution built its case carefully, calling witnesses who had heard Virgil and Floyd bragging about the attack, presenting physical evidence that tied them to the scene, describing the devastation they had caused to a family that had done nothing to deserve it. The prosecutor was a skilled orator who understood that the facts of the case were on his side, that the jury needed only to understand what had happened to reach the verdict he sought. He described Powder's final moments in detail that brought the sisters to tears, painting a picture of an 18-year-old boy who had thrown himself into the path of bullets to save the people he loved. He described the wounds that Powder had suffered, the multiple gunshots to his back and shoulders and legs, the physical evidence of a sacrifice that had been complete and absolute. He asked the jury to imagine what it must have been like to feel bullets tearing through your body while you held your sisters and refused to let go. The defense struggled against facts that seemed impossible to mitigate. The defense argued that the attack had been intended as intimidation rather than murder, that no one was supposed to die, that the bullets were meant to frighten rather than kill. They pointed to Floyd's intoxication as evidence that the attack had been poorly planned, that the death of Powder Brown was a tragic accident rather than deliberate homicide. They suggested that the wrong house had been targeted, that the Brown family was never supposed to be involved, that the whole tragedy was a terrible mistake. The arguments were clever, but ultimately unsuccessful, as the jury rejected the idea that firing dozens of rounds into a house full of sleeping people could be anything other than an attempt to kill. The jurors deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on all charges. When the foreman read the verdicts, a murmur of satisfaction went through the courtroom, a recognition that justice, however inadequate, had been achieved. The sentencing hearing that followed was emotional, with family members testifying about what Powder had meant to them, about what his loss had cost them, about the hole he had left in their lives. Ruth read one of her poems, a tribute to her brother that reduced the courtroom to tears. Martha spoke about the guilt she carried, the survivor's guilt that she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life. Sarah was too young to testify, but her presence in the courtroom, her tear-stained face, made its own argument about the impact of what the defendants had done. Virgil Carter was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, a sentence that was carried out at the Tennessee State Prison in Nashville in July 1941. Floyd Carter was convicted of conspiracy and received a sentence of 25 years, of which he served 15 before being released on parole. The verdicts provided what justice the legal system could offer, but they could not bring Powder Brown back, could not heal the wounds that his family carried, could not restore the future that had been stolen from an 18-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong. The funeral of Powder Brown was the largest gathering Hancock County had ever seen, with people traveling from throughout the region to pay their respects to a young man whose sacrifice had captured the imagination of everyone who heard the story. The church was too small to hold the crowd, which spilled into the yard and down the road, hundreds of people who had come to honor a hero whose heroism had cost him everything. The service lasted for hours, with multiple preachers taking turns at the pulpit, each trying to capture in words what Powder had done and what it meant. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered, and testimony was given by neighbors and friends who had known Powder throughout his short life. They spoke of his character, his devotion to his family, his willingness to help anyone who asked. They spoke of his skill as a hunter and a farmer, his patience and his quiet strength. They spoke of a young man who had been taken far too soon, whose potential would never be realized, whose absence would be felt for generations. The preacher who delivered the main eulogy struggled to find words adequate to what Powder had done. He spoke of sacrifice, of love, of the bond between a brother and his sisters that death itself could not break. He spoke of the courage required to throw oneself into the path of bullets, to choose death over the safety that could have been found by staying hidden. He spoke of a young man who had barely begun to live, whose future had stretched before him full of possibility, who had given that future away so that 3 young girls could have futures of their own. He quoted scripture about laying down one's life for one's friends, about the love that knows no greater expression than sacrifice. He compared Powder to the martyrs of old, to those who had died for their faith, to all those throughout history who had chosen death over betrayal of those they loved. He acknowledged that such comparisons seemed almost inadequate, that what Powder had done was so pure, so complete, that it stood alone as an example of what love could demand and what love could give. The burial that followed the service was private, limited to family and close friends who gathered at the cemetery on the ridge above the Brown homestead. The grave had been dug beside those of generations of Browns, in soil that held the remains of ancestors who had worked this land for more than a century. Powder would rest among his people, surrounded by the dead who had preceded him and eventually joined by those who would follow. The grave where Powder Brown was buried became a place of pilgrimage almost immediately, visited by people who wanted to pay respects to a hero whose story had touched something deep in the regional consciousness. The stone that marked his resting place bore an epitaph that his mother had chosen. He laid down his life for those he loved. The words were simple, but captured the essence of what Powder had done. The choice he had made in those final moments when choosing was still possible. The grave has been maintained continuously since 1940, tended first by Powder's parents and later by his siblings and their descendants. Flowers appear there regularly, left by visitors who have heard the story and want to acknowledge it in some tangible way. The grass is always trimmed, the stone always clean. The area always cared for with an attention that reflects the importance of what happened and who is buried there. On the anniversary of his death, October 15th, family members gather at the grave to remember him. They share stories about Powder, passing down memories to younger generations who never knew him, but who carry his name and his legacy. They read Ruth's poems aloud, the verses she wrote to honor her brother, the words that have become the official record of what he did and what it meant. They stand in silence for a moment, acknowledging the sacrifice that made their presence possible, that gave them the lives they are living. The years following Powder's death brought changes to the Brown family that reflected the magnitude of what they had lost. Martha, who was 16 at the time of the attack, never fully escaped the guilt of surviving when her brother had died. She married, had children, lived a life that was outwardly normal, but those who knew her well understood that something essential had been damaged that night, that she would never entirely believe she deserved the life her brother had purchased for her. The survivor's guilt that Martha carried manifested in ways that were not always visible to casual observers. She drove herself relentlessly, working harder than anyone needed to work, as if trying to earn through effort what had been given to her through sacrifice. She could not accept praise without deflecting it, could not acknowledge her own accomplishments without feeling that she had stolen them from someone who deserved them more. She was a good wife and a devoted mother, but the joy that should have accompanied these roles was always tempered by a grief that never fully healed. Her children sensed something in their mother that they could not name, a sadness that seemed to have no source, a distance that appeared at unexpected moments. She told them about their Uncle Powder, made sure they knew his story, but she could never convey the full weight of what his sacrifice meant to her. How could she explain that every birthday she celebrated, every milestone she reached, every moment of happiness she experienced, came at the cost of her brother's life? The arithmetic of sacrifice did not allow for such explanations. Ruth, 14 at the time, channeled her grief into the writing that had always been her refuge. She composed poems and stories about Powder, about sacrifice, about the nature of love that gives everything without counting the cost. Her work was published in regional journals and newspapers, bringing her brother's story to audiences who had never heard of Hancock County or the Brown family. She became a schoolteacher, devoted her life to children, never married, never felt that anyone could deserve the love that her brother had shown her. The writing became Ruth's way of keeping Powder alive, of ensuring that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. She wrote about him directly, recounting the events of that night, describing the brother she had known and loved. But she also wrote about him indirectly, creating characters who embodied his virtues, telling stories about courage and devotion that were really about him, even when his name never appeared. Her students read her work without knowing its true source, absorbed lessons about love and sacrifice, without understanding that their teacher was still grieving a loss that had occurred decades before they were born. She never married, because no one could compare to her brother. No relationship could replicate the devotion he had shown. This was not a conscious decision, but an unavoidable reality, a standard set so impossibly high that no living man could reach it. She had suitors over the years, men who were attracted by her intelligence and her quiet beauty. But something always held her back, some recognition that what she sought in a partner did not exist, at least not for her. And Sarah, the youngest, just 11 years old on the night she should have died, was perhaps the most affected of all. She had nightmares for years, woke screaming in the night, felt her brother's body covering hers every time she closed her eyes. The physical memory of that night never left her, the weight of his body pressing down on her, the sound of bullets striking flesh, the warmth of his blood soaking through her nightgown. These sensations returned to her unbidden, triggered by sounds or smells or circumstances that her conscious mind could not predict. She grew up haunted by survivor's guilt that no therapy could fully address, by the knowledge that she was alive only because someone she loved was dead. The mathematics of her existence were simple and devastating. She was here because he was not. Every breath she took was a breath he could not take. Every moment of her life was a moment stolen from his. She carried this knowledge like a stone in her chest, always present, always heavy, impossible to set down. She married young, perhaps seeking the security that the attack had stolen from her, and had children she named after the brother who had saved her life. Her first son was Jeremiah Isaiah, Powder's given name, a child who would grow up knowing that he bore the name of an uncle who had died heroically decades before his birth. Her second son was named Isaiah, after her wounded father. Her daughter was named Rebecca, after her mother. The naming was deliberate, an attempt to honor those who had suffered, to ensure that their memory would continue through future generations. The grave where Powder Brown was buried became a place of pilgrimage almost immediately, visited by people who wanted to pay respects to a hero whose story had touched something deep in the regional consciousness. The stone that marked his resting place bore an epitaph that his mother had chosen. He laid down his life for those he loved. The words were simple, but captured the essence of what Powder had done, the choice he had made in those final moments when choosing was still possible. The years following Powder's death brought changes to the Brown family that reflected the magnitude of what they had lost. Isaiah Brown never fully recovered from his wound, the damaged shoulder limiting his ability to work the farm he had maintained all his life. Rebecca aged decades in the months following the attack, her hair going white, her posture stooping, her eyes carrying a sadness that never lifted. The older brothers eventually moved away, unable to remain in a place so saturated with grief, seeking new lives in cities where no one knew their story. Only the sisters remained in Hancock County, bound to the place where their brother had died saving them, unable to leave the ground that held his body. They maintained the family homestead after their parents passed, kept the cabin where the attack had occurred, preserved the room where Powder had given his life as a kind of shrine to his memory. Visitors who came to see them were shown the bullet holes that still marked the walls, the window frames that had been repaired but never replaced, the physical evidence of a night that had changed everything. The story of Powder Brown passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about him, ballads that celebrated his courage and mourned his death. Some portrayed him as a hero whose sacrifice demonstrated the highest virtue that any person could achieve. Others focused on the waste of his death, the tragedy of a life cut short by violence that should never have occurred. All of them agreed that what he had done deserved to be remembered. The first songs appeared within weeks of the funeral, composed by local musicians who had been moved by the story. These early ballads were simple, built on traditional melodies with new words that told Powder's story. They spread through the mountains by word of mouth, learned by one community, and carried to the next, modified and embellished as they traveled until multiple versions existed, each emphasizing different aspects of the story. One popular ballad described the moment when Powder threw himself over his sisters, imagining the thoughts that might have passed through his mind in those final seconds. The song captured the terror of the attack, the chaos of the gunfire, the desperate courage of a young man who chose to die rather than let his sisters be harmed. It portrayed his decision as instantaneous, reflexive, the natural response of a soul that had been formed by love and loyalty and the mountain values that demanded everything from those who held them. The imagery in this song was vivid and haunting, describing bullets tearing through walls, sisters screaming in terror, and a brother who did not hesitate for even a moment. It imagined Powder's thoughts as he ran toward the gunfire rather than away from it, as he burst through the door of his sister's room, as he threw his body over theirs and felt the first bullets strike. The song suggested that there was no fear in those thoughts, only love, only determination, only the absolute commitment to protect that had defined him his entire life. Another song told the story from the perspective of the sisters, describing their grief and their guilt, and their eternal gratitude for the gift their brother had given them. This song was more mournful, focusing on the survivors rather than the sacrifice, capturing the complexity of emotions that the sisters carried for the rest of their lives. It acknowledged that Powder's gift had been absolute, that nothing they could do would ever repay what he had done, that they would spend their lives trying to be worthy of the price he had paid. The verses about each sister were distinct, reflecting their different personalities and their different ways of carrying the burden. Martha's verse described her endless work, her inability to rest, her conviction that she must earn through effort what had been given through sacrifice. Ruth's verse described her poems, her attempts to capture in words what could not be expressed, her mission to ensure that her brother would never be forgotten. Sarah's verse was the most painful, describing a child's nightmares, a child's guilt, a child's desperate need to understand why she was alive when someone she loved had died for her. A third song addressed the attackers, Virgil and Floyd Carter, describing their drunken mistake and its devastating consequences. This song was angrier than the others, condemning the culture of violence that had produced men capable of such acts, demanding accountability not just from the individuals, but from the community that had allowed feuding to continue. It portrayed Powder's death as a waste that could have been prevented, a tragedy that should shame everyone who had tolerated the conditions that made it possible. The final verses of this song were almost prophetic, warning that such tragedies would continue to occur unless the community changed its ways. It described the blood on everyone's hands, the guilt that extended beyond the two men who had pulled the triggers, the responsibility that every person bore who had participated in or condoned the feuding culture. It was a challenging song, uncomfortable to sing and uncomfortable to hear, but it captured truths that needed to be spoken. The most famous of all the Powder Brown songs was composed several years after his death by a professional musician who had heard the story and traveled to Hancock County to learn more. This song, known simply as Powder Brown, combined elements of all the earlier ballads into a comprehensive narrative that told the complete story with skill and emotional power. It was recorded and distributed throughout the region, becoming a standard in the repertoire of mountain musicians. The song has been performed for over 80 years, covered by dozens of artists, included in collections of Appalachian music that have brought it to audiences who never heard of Hancock County. Each new generation of musicians has found something in the song that speaks to them, something about love and sacrifice that transcends its specific time and place. Powder Brown's story, captured in those verses, has achieved a kind of immortality that his short life never could have achieved on its own. Historians who have studied the Powder Brown case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of the violence that continued to plague isolated mountain communities even into the 20th century, arguing that the feuding culture that produced the attack represented a failure of modernization, a persistence of old patterns that should have been eliminated by education and economic development. They see Powder's death as symptomatic of broader social problems that extended far beyond this single incident. These scholars have traced the roots of mountain feuding back to cultural patterns brought from Scotland and Ireland, traditions of clan loyalty and blood vengeance that survived transplantation to America and persisted in isolated communities long after they had disappeared elsewhere. They argue that the Hendricks-Carter dispute that led to the attack on the Brown family was not an anomaly, but a continuation of patterns that had been destroying families for generations. Powder Brown was simply the latest victim of a cultural pathology that the mountains had never fully escaped. The isolation of communities like Hancock County made intervention difficult, as outsiders had little influence, and local authorities were often themselves enmeshed in the feuding networks. Law enforcement was weak, courts were unreliable, and the state's ability to impose order was limited by geography and by the resistance of communities that prized their independence above all other values. These conditions created spaces where violence could flourish, where disputes escalated because no effective mechanism existed to resolve them peacefully. Others have focused on the heroism itself, seeing in Powder's sacrifice a demonstration of human capacity that transcends its specific context. They argue that his choice to die protecting his sisters reveals something essential about love and its demands, about the willingness to give everything for those we care about. They note that such heroism appears in every culture and every era, suggesting that it reflects something fundamental in human nature rather than something specific to mountain society. These scholars have compared Powder's sacrifice to other documented instances of protective heroism, finding common patterns that suggest a deep human capacity for selfless action. Parents who die protecting children, soldiers who throw themselves on grenades to save their comrades, strangers who risk their lives to rescue people they have never met. All of these instances share something with what Powder did, a willingness to accept death rather than allow others to die. The neurological and psychological research on such behavior suggests that it may be grounded in brain structures and social instincts that evolved over millions of years. The protective impulse toward kin, particularly toward those we have helped raise, appears to be deeply rooted in our biology, capable of overriding the survival instinct when circumstances demand. Powder's sacrifice, from this perspective, was not an anomaly but an expression of something fundamental, a capacity that exists in most humans and that can be activated by the right circumstances. Still, others have examined the gender dynamics of the case, noting that Powder's sacrifice followed traditional patterns that assigned men the role of protector and women the role of protected. They observed that this framing, while valorizing Powder's courage, also reinforced assumptions about female vulnerability and male responsibility that had complicated implications. Feminist scholars have noted that the sisters' survival came at a cost beyond their brother's death. They were positioned as passive recipients of protection rather than as agents capable of protecting themselves. Their subsequent lives were shaped by gratitude and guilt, emotions that bound them to traditional roles and limited their ability to define themselves on their own terms. Martha's endless work, Ruth's spinsterhood, Sarah's early marriage, all of these outcomes reflected in some way the constraints imposed by a sacrifice they had not requested and could never repay. This critique does not diminish Powder's heroism, but contextualizes it within cultural patterns that had implications beyond the immediate tragedy. The system that produced heroes who died protecting women also produced women who could not protect themselves, who depended on men for safety, who faced vulnerability that better social arrangements might have prevented. The attack that killed Powder would have been less deadly if the sisters had been taught to defend themselves, had access to weapons, had been positioned as protectors rather than merely as protected. You see, what Powder Brown did cannot be questioned or criticized by any moral framework. He gave his life for his sisters, chose their survival over his own, demonstrated a love so complete that it accepted death as its price. This is the highest form of sacrifice, the act that every religious tradition honors as the ultimate expression of virtue. There is nothing to condemn in what he did, nothing to qualify or complicate, only admiration and grief for a young man who deserved to live and chose to die. And yet his story cannot be told without acknowledging the context that made his sacrifice necessary. The feuding culture that produced the attack, the alcohol that impaired Floyd Carter's judgment, the failure of law enforcement to prevent violence that everyone knew was coming, the economic conditions that kept communities isolated and desperate. All of these factors contributed to the tragedy that unfolded on that October night. Powder Brown was a hero, but he was also a victim, destroyed by forces that should never have been allowed to threaten him or his family. His story challenges us to consider what we owe to those who sacrifice for us, how we honor gifts that can never be repaid. The sisters who survived because of Powder's death spent their lives grappling with this question, never finding an answer that fully satisfied them. They tried to live well, to be worthy of what their brother had done, to honor his memory through the choices they made. But the weight of his gift never lifted, never became easier to carry, remained with them until their own deaths ended the burden. The specific circumstances that produced the Powder Brown story, the feuding culture and the isolated communities and the patterns of violence have largely disappeared from American life. The mountains of Hancock County are connected now to the broader world in ways that were impossible in 1940. Young men no longer ride through the night with guns to terrorize their neighbors. The conditions that made Powder's death possible have been transformed by decades of change. But the capacity for sacrifice that Powder demonstrated has not disappeared. Every day people give their lives for those they love, make choices that put others' survival above their own, demonstrate that the bonds of family and affection can be stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. Soldiers and first responders and ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances continue to prove that what Powder did was not an anomaly, but an expression of something permanent in human nature. The descendants of the Brown family carry the memory of Powder through the generations, telling his story to children who never knew him, keeping alive the example of what love can demand and what love can give. Family reunions include visits to his grave, moments of reflection on a sacrifice that made everything that followed possible. The children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Martha and Ruth and Sarah owe their existence to an 18-year-old boy who died before any of them were born, whose choice to throw his body over 3 terrified girls created the future that they inhabit. The mountains of Hancock County remain today, much as they were in 1940, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollows still shelter families who have lived there for generations, descendants of the people who gathered for Powder's funeral and mourned a hero's death. The cabin where the attack occurred has been preserved, maintained by family members who could not bear to see it destroyed. A monument to a night that should never have happened and a sacrifice that should never have been necessary. The community that surrounds the Brown homestead has changed in many ways since 1940, connected now to the broader world through roads and communications that were impossible in Powder's time. Young people leave for cities, seeking opportunities that the mountains cannot provide, and the population of the county has declined with each passing decade. The feuding culture that produced the attack has largely disappeared, replaced by disputes that are resolved through courts and conversations rather than through violence. But the memory of what happened persists, kept alive by family members who continue to tell the story, who bring their children and grandchildren to visit the grave, who ensure that each new generation understands what Powder did and what it means. The story has become a kind of inheritance, passed down like the family Bible or the deeds to the land, a possession that cannot be measured in monetary terms, but that has value beyond calculation. The bullet holes are still visible in the walls of the room where Powder died. Preserved under protective glass, that allows visitors to see the evidence of what occurred. The window frames have been replaced multiple times over the decades, but the original frames were kept, stored in a local museum along with other artifacts from that night. The physical traces of the tragedy have been carefully maintained, ensuring that the story cannot be forgotten even as those who lived it pass away. The museum that houses these artifacts is small, operated by volunteers who care about local history. It contains photographs of Powder and his family, copies of the newspaper articles that covered his death and the subsequent trial, recordings of the songs that have been written about him. Visitors can see the clothes he was wearing that night, still stained with the blood he shed protecting his sisters. They can read Ruth's poems, listen to Martha's recorded testimony from the trial, examine the physical evidence of a sacrifice that occurred more than 80 years ago. School groups visit the museum and the cabin, learning about a story that has become part of the regional curriculum. Teachers use Powder's sacrifice to discuss values like courage and love and family loyalty, asking students to imagine what they would do in similar circumstances. The discussions that follow are always intense as young people grapple with questions about sacrifice that have no easy answers. What does it mean to give one's life for another? How do we honor those who make such sacrifices? What obligations do we owe to those who die saving us? Those who live in these mountains still tell stories about Powder Brown, about the brother who died saving his sisters, about what happens when love faces its ultimate test. The stories are told at family gatherings and community events, passed from elders to children, preserved in the collective memory of a people who have always valued loyalty and sacrifice above all other virtues. Powder has become a symbol, an example, a standard against which other acts of courage are measured. His name is invoked when people want to illustrate what family loyalty truly means, when they want to show what love demands at its highest expression. He has become almost mythical, larger than life, representing something that actual human beings rarely achieve. But the myth is grounded in reality, in a night that actually occurred, in a sacrifice that was actually made. Powder Brown was real and what he did was real, and that reality gives the story its power. The story of Powder Brown endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love, and what love becomes when it is tested beyond all reasonable limits, when the choice is between one's own life and the lives of those one loves. It is the story of courage and what courage means when courage costs everything, when there is no reward, except the knowledge that others will live because you chose to die. It is, finally, a story that offers something rare in narratives of violence, a hero whose heroism is pure, untainted by vengeance or anger or any motive except the protection of those who could not protect themselves. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Powder Brown stood, to see the cabin where he died, to visit the grave where his body rests? Would you walk the paths he walked, breathe the mountain air he breathed, feel the wind that has blown through these hollows since before any European set foot here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the cabin is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Knoxville takes several hours, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The pavement gives way to gravel, the gravel to dirt, and the dirt to paths that require vehicles with high clearance and drivers with confidence. The journey itself becomes part of the experience, a pilgrimage that demands something from those who make it, that requires commitment before the destination can be reached. The cabin appears suddenly, emerging from the forest at the end of a road that seems to lead nowhere. It is smaller than photographs suggest, a humble structure that reflects the modest circumstances of the family who lived there. The walls are weathered but sound, maintained by descendants who refuse to let their ancestors' final resting place fall into decay. The porch where Powder sometimes sat on summer evenings still supports a chair, though the chair itself has been replaced many times over the years. Inside, the main room is arranged much as it was on the night of the attack. The fireplace where Powder was sitting when he heard the horses approaching still dominates the space. The hallway down which he ran to reach his sisters leads to their room, preserved now as a memorial rather than a living space. Visitors are allowed to enter with a guide who explains what happened, who points out the details that bring the story to life. The room where Powder died is the most powerful space in the cabin. The bullet holes in the walls, each one marked and numbered, create a pattern that tells its own story. The guides explain which bullets struck Powder, which passed over his body to embed themselves in the walls beyond, which would have killed his sisters if he had not been there to absorb them. The physical evidence makes the sacrifice tangible in a way that words alone cannot achieve. The grave is a short walk from the cabin, up a path that Powder must have walked hundreds of times during his short life. The family cemetery sits on a ridge overlooking the hollow, surrounded by trees that have grown tall in the decades since 1940. The headstones of Powder's ancestors are there, Browns who lived and died in these mountains going back more than a century. His stone stands among them, not the largest or the most elaborate, but somehow the most prominent, the one that draws the eye. Visitors often leave flowers at the grave, tokens of respect for a sacrifice they have learned about but can never fully understand. Some leave notes, expressions of gratitude or admiration or simple acknowledgement that they have heard the story and been moved by it. These offerings are collected periodically by family members, stored in boxes that preserve the evidence of how widely Powder's story has traveled, how many hearts it has touched. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Powder Brown close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. His story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Hancock County on that terrible night, as long as brothers love their sisters with a ferocity that defies death itself, as long as sacrifice remains the highest expression of what it means to be human. He is gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the mountains where he was born and raised and died. But what he did echoes still through time, and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. The lessons of his story are not complicated, but they are profound, and they are eternal. Love sometimes demands everything. Courage can exist in ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. The bonds of family can be stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. These are simple truths, but they are truths that need to be remembered, truths that can be forgotten in the distractions of daily life. Powder Brown's sacrifice reminds us of them, calls us back to what matters most, challenges us to consider whether we would have the courage to do what he did. The descendants of those who knew him continue to find meaning in his example. They name their children after him, tell his story at family gatherings, visit his grave on the anniversary of his death. They carry forward a legacy that has become part of their identity, a heritage of sacrifice and love that shapes how they understand themselves and their place in the world. Powder Brown may have died on that October night in 1940, but in some ways he is more alive today than many who still draw breath. His sacrifice remembered and honored. And that, my friend, is the true story of Powder Brown, who died shielding his 3 sisters from 2 masked gunmen who had come to the wrong house on a night when everything went terribly and tragically wrong, when a simple navigational error born of drunkenness and carelessness created a tragedy that would echo through generations. A story of love and loss, of courage and ultimate sacrifice, of a young man who had barely begun to live, but who proved in his final moments that he understood what living truly meant, what family truly meant, what love truly demanded when it was tested beyond all human limits. The mountains remember his name and his courageous and selfless sacrifice and his eternal love, and through them, so do we all, now and forevermore. As long as love exists and families protect their own, and brothers lay down their lives for their sisters in the ultimate and most beautiful and eternal act of devotion.